This week on Geekarati, we're going to discuss when a game, a role-playing game, is actually considered dead.
Hello and welcome to Geekarati.
For geeks, by geeks, and with geeks.
Life below the earth. Welcome to Overtime.
Brave enough to do battle with hideous monsters.
I am Sinistar.
Hello and welcome to Geekarati. I'm Christian Linke and I'm your host here at Geekarati Media, where we discuss movies, television, and, well, most of our time, role-playing games. As you may have noticed, I've been doing a lot of discussions of older role-playing games, and if you like my content as I discuss these, please like and subscribe. It'll help me grow the channel, which is something I'd really like to do. I have a great love for pop culture, and in particular, tabletop gaming, and I'd love to share that with the world, and I've got a lot of experience, and I hope some insights that you might share with the gaming community. So that brings me to this week's topic. When is a game actually considered dead? So this is going to be thoughts about the Dungeons & Dragons game, other role-playing games, but it's a discussion that's inspired by a book called Things We Think About Games, and I'll get to that more later. But to take a step back, and you know that if you read either my Geekarati Media Substack or have watched any of my past videos, I like to take a step back and do kind of a long preface to things. But a while back I read a newsletter by Jim Zub, who is a comic book writer and game designer, and he wrote some thoughts on his Substack, the Zubstack, about how D&D has evolved over the years and how impromptu the old versions of the game were in comparison to the new version. And while these aren't shocking revelations to fans of old school games, it was a true statement that I thought was worth exploring in the modern gaming environment. So as I was thinking about writing a response, my mind came up with a list of older games that had game mechanics that simulated or encouraged simulating or acting upon mundane activities in games. And these are games that ostensibly were devoted to heroic activities. So some of the activities that I'm thinking of ranged from item creation and crafting rules in Dungeons & Dragons 3rd Edition. Heck, it even had rules for how much money you made performing or how much money you made as an innkeeper, right? Those were things that you could just keep track of. You could, in fact, have that be your entire campaign, never having any combat, just doing those things, earning money and experience points, and leveling up. It might take time, and it would be a very different game than maybe other people would play, but the mechanics were there to encourage, with the profession, skill, that kind of play. And then I got to thinking about older games like DC Heroes, which had a gadgeteering rules system, right? That was, I think, very good, but which a lot of people tried to have produce mundane items like forks and things like that. And then there were the karma rules of the Marvel Superheroes game that TSR put out in the 1980s. And the karma rules asked players to make sure that Peter Parker got the birthday present for Aunt May, or made sure that he delivered the photographs to J. Jonah Jameson of Spider-Man fighting Venom. Otherwise, he wouldn't earn karma, but he would earn karma if he did those things. And then there were the kingdom governing rules of the birthright setting for AD&D 2nd Edition, right? That here's this task governing, and here's a setting that had rules for it. And all of these are somewhat what we consider mundane, non-heroic activities, but these games had rules for that. And when I looked back at that list, I came to realize that a lot of those games are what we would consider to be dead properties. Even 3rd Edition Dungeons & Dragons is a dead game. That game was released over 20 years ago. So once I realized these were dead games, that made me think about an entry that I'd read in the book Things We Think About Games by Will Hindmarch and Jeff Tidball. It was their statement 88. Quite simply, the statement is, a game that is no longer supported is called dead. Their response to this is, that's business jargon. Don't let the state of a game line's release schedule determine whether or not you play it. Play it because it's fun. And I can't emphasize that enough. And in fact, gamers who are active in the old school Renaissance community or those who are involved in the indie itch.io community, they're definitely followers of this maxim. The OSR, since the creation of the Open Gaming License, which put the mechanics of 3rd edition D&D into the open community for us all to play with, and created a framework for others to use to allow people to use even more rule sets in that way, the old school Renaissance has been actively promoting the play and retrocloning of older role-playing games. And, as I mentioned, the Open Gaming License allowed newer story gamers and game designers to share their mechanics and allow other people to build games. And then there's the whole story game community that has long allowed people to use their rules or encouraged people to use their rules. And you see things like that in Blades in the Dark or other story games where they'll list the rules that inspired them, right? So you might say, oh man, I'm an Apocalypse World fan, and then you look in the Apocalypse World rulebook and it says, hey, have you checked out Inspectors? Because that inspired this game, right? So there is this sense of creativity and building upon an openness in the game design community or in these indie and open and OSR communities that seek to continue the legacy of dead games. And some of the games, specific games that have benefited from the OSR in particular, let's say, include Dungeons and Dragons. They've done versions of the original D&D, Advanced D&D, the basic, both BX, which is the basic and expert, and BECMI, which is basic, expert, master, companion, and immortal rule sets. They've also done a second edition AD&D version, Rollmaster, Gamma World. TSR's old Conan RPG has an OSR version, as does Marvel Superheroes. And every one of these games had an OSR reboot designed for kind of two purposes, right? Two reasons. The first is to introduce new players to the game. It really is. I mean, even if it's for the second reason, which is to rekindle the imaginations of old school players and to remember the joys of those early systems, well, that's a part of it. It's really to invite new gamers in, because we who've played these older game systems, we want to play them with new people, right? We want to get them excited about the things that we're excited about. The reason I did the video on Superhero 2044 is because I want people to be excited about Superhero 2044, right? That's the whole reason for the discussion. So these homage editions, though, they vary often between efforts that retrofit the rule set made open by the OGL and other efforts that are designed under the assumption that the specific wording of rules can be copyrighted, but not the underlying mechanics, right? So we have two. We have like the formally open, and then we have the kind of using copyright law or an understanding of copyright law to release games that don't violate IP, but do present mechanics that are fun. So regardless of how technically correct those who design games under that second assumption might be, they've all made a concerted effort to avoid the use of undeniable product identity. So for example, the Zephyrs game, which is based on TSR's Conan game, shares none of the IP with that, but it does provide the rule set in a really intelligible and fun and easy to play form, and 4C does the same with the face rip system of TSR's Marvel Superheroes. They fall into this category, and they demonstrate that you can make an engaging RPG while stripping out the underlying trademarked source material. I think that creators like this are doing us as gamers a great service. These products have been completely abandoned by their creators for sometimes very good reasons, right? TSR can't make a Conan game. They no longer have the license to make that game. They can't make a Marvel game. They no longer have the license for that. Marvel's making their own game. So we have the owners of the IP seeking new versions of their games, but these old rule sets have people who love them and who played them with those IP. So it allows them to continue to play those games, to introduce them to new people without violating the product identity or IP of an existing company. For a while, back in the before times and the not now, I was a very active member in the DC Heroes online community. And it's a community that was so active in support of the game that some of its members licensed the right to produce another game based on that system in order to keep it alive. The game that was licensed is called Blood of Heroes, and it wasn't necessarily the most classic looking when it came to illustrations. Very much it looks to be a product of the 90s, but it contained a meticulously play-tested version of the underlying mechanics of the DC Heroes role-playing game. And what's interesting is that even though Pulsar Games, that's the company that produced the game and was made up of fans of the DC Heroes, what's called MEG's system, licensed the use of the rules, they may still not have been perfectly within the law. According to Ray Winninger, who was the author of the second edition of DC Heroes and of a derivative role-playing game also published by Mayfair Games called Underground, as for DC Heroes itself, our contract with DC specified that DC Comics holds the copyright on every product we released. If you check the indices, you'll notice they all say copyright DC Comics Inc. The contracts didn't specify anything like Mayfair owns the copyright to the actual game rules while DC retains the rights to its IP or anything similar, just that all DC products are copyright DC Comics, period. This would suggest that DC actually owns DC Heroes. I know for certain that DC believes they own all rights to the game and everything produced for it, and I suspect they're probably right. I'm going to take an aside here from Ray Winninger, and you can read about the kind of controversy around the Fables comic and Bill Willinghams putting that in the public domain and the conflict he's having with DC Heroes, or with DC, to see the kind of mindset they have about IP and about the things that were published with their license. Going back now to Ray's point, his second point was that Greg Gordon, who's the designer of first edition DC Heroes, and really one of the great game designers, period, as I mentioned last week in the review of Dragon Quest, he was the one who came on in second edition that improved that. Gordon believes that his contract specified that he retained ownership of the DC Heroes game system once it was out of print. When I was at Mayfair, I looked for this agreement and couldn't find it. The I here is Ray Winninger, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. One potential problem is that it's unclear that Mayfair could have made such an arrangement with Greg in the first place. Remember, the DC licensing agreement specified DC would retain full and perpetual copyright over everything that was released. Pulsar licensed DC Heroes from Mayfair, but it's not 100% clear that Mayfair had the necessary rights to gain such a license in the first place. You can see the first 2 points that I listed before. Ray believes that Pulsar may later have made a separate agreement with Greg. And then Ray goes on to talk about Underground, which he says uses a variant of the DC Heroes system, but none of its specific tables or charts or text, and the copyright to Underground is not tied to the rights to DC in any way. Mayfair no longer owns the rights to Underground, implying, of course, that Ray owns the rights to Underground or someone else does. And his assertion here is one that fits within that second tier, which is that the mechanics themselves are not necessarily copyrightable. And if you look at the way that he changed it from one logarithmic scale to a different logarithmic scale. In fact, it's a logarithmic scale that's 1/3 the rate, so things double every 3 instead of double every single value as they do in DC Heroes. So if you have a strength of 2 in DC Heroes, double that strength is a strength of 3, but in Underground, a strength of 5 is twice as strong as a strength of 2. And the reason for that is that characters in Underground don't run as wide a gamut as the heroes in DC do, where you have to have heroes ranging from Robin to Superman, or from Calendar Man to Doomsday. Those are very difficult to do in a single statistical system, but if you have a logarithmic scale, that enables you to do it pretty easily. And if you want to shrink that down and get a little more granular, you just modify the rate of the logarithm, the logarithmic increase on that. So my thoughts on this are that since DC released a series on YouTube a couple of years ago called DC All-Stars, where Freddie Prinze Jr. ran a short DC Heroes campaign on their channel. And I highly recommend watching it, by the way, because 1, DC Heroes is my favorite role-playing game of all time, and 2, it's really cool to see people enjoy the game system and show people how it works. The point is, though, that DC releasing that very much believes that they hold absolute copyright over the rules, though I would say maybe they don't own it over the rules, but they certainly own it over the game. So what's technically legal with regard to underlying rules hasn't really ever truly been tested in a court of law, so do not rely on me, a non-IP attorney, for what this is. Go to a copyright attorney if you're going to be using existing rules that aren't under the Open Gaming License. In general, I favor greater protections for game rules than the law currently holds, but I'm also a huge advocate of greater creator rights in general and a diminishing of the dreaded work-for-hire kind of thing that pervades the industry. In other words, I want the individual creators to have more rights rather than the companies that hire them, whether that's on the rules that they design or whether it's the characters they design for comic books. But I also want there to be some flexibility for people to be able to build off of those rules as long as they aren't doing a particular expression. So to give you an example of what I mean here is, when I first started my podcast, I did an interview with Wolfgang Bauer, and we talked about his work on the Dark Matter setting for the alternative role-playing game that he worked on for Wizards of the Coast and for TSR. And I said, oh, you got royalties, because I assumed publishing, IP royalties. And I was surprised that he did not get any residuals from it, that in fact that it was a work for hire. And to me, that gives a sense that, that's a little bit broken. Now, on the positive side, the wild west nature of the protections given to underlying mechanics do mean that we don't have to wait for a company to officially declare that something is abandonware before we start producing products and reworking the underlying mechanics for a neglected fan base, right? And this is what we're really talking about. And actually, I'm in favor of that, right? I think that the core mechanics, so long as you really do make an effort to remove from them the IP, they should be allowed to be played with by the community at large. And not just because I think you should make an exact clone of those rules, but because you can see development. I'll talk a little bit in a later video about a connection I think exists between Archie Cass's old wargaming rules that were published in the 1950s and the wargame rules for the command and color systems that Richard Borg has done today, that they share certain qualities and that they're both excellent rule sets, and that Richard Borg's are not those older rules, but they wouldn't exist necessarily without those being in the ether. They're an evolution of them, right, that improve things. And I'll talk about that at a later time. But that's true of so many things, right? And it's true of Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of games that existed after Dungeons and Dragons were very similar. A lot were nothing like them. But we needed those rules to be in that kind of dialogue. So in a world where role-playing games can be stored on servers at close to zero cost for fans to purchase at any future time, I'm of the opinion there's no excuse for letting a game die. Right? A company's bottom line with regard to a product does not determine the lifespan of play, and since the production costs of storing a 10 megabyte file on a hard drive are not particularly high, particularly when you can put that burden on another company, as say Wizards of the Coast does with Drive-Thru RPG for their line of products, it lowers that production cost. The production cost is near zero. It's not zero, but it's near zero. So no longer is the lifespan of a product being publishable, right, because print on demand, limited to massive print runs. The lifespan of play should decide things. And while, being able to produce at mass levels might determine some kind of product lifespan, which is why we're seeing a new edition of Dungeons & Dragons coming out this year. Yes, one D&D 2024, whatever you want to call it, is a new edition. It revises enough rules, it's a new publication, it changes significant things. It's a new edition, but it's also a new opportunity for us to come in. It's a backward compatible edition, as second edition was. But product lifespan is not play lifespan. It is fans and creators working after a product has died who determine whether a game is truly dead. And the internet has ensured that so many games aren't actually dead. Think about Lasers and Feelings by John Harper. Lasers and Feelings was a game that was produced once. It is played widely. It is actually even a free game that you can just go and pick up, and there are dozens of variants, and I'll talk about those in a future video as well. Now, I'll be honest, I still miss receiving daily digests from DC Heroes Yahoo group. And the Groups.io legacy replacement lacks the vibrant activity of that original group. Maybe DC Heroes is a game that's finally dying. I hope not, and I'll continue to include some kind of DC Heroes-inspired stuff in the coming year. I'm certainly going to do a review, and I may even do a pulp adaptation, by which I mean a sword and sorcery adaptation of DC Heroes, and a superhero adaptation too. Even with the decline in activity in the Group IO and the complete loss of the Yahoo group, I still see people reworking the rules and converting characters to DC Heroes. Right? There's an entire fan base designed to store character stats for the game. It is still robustly supported. The game Savage Worlds, which I also love, as you can see behind me, I've got some of the Savage Worlds stuff on the shelf behind me, would likely never have gained the audience it has today if it was not for digital distribution and devoted fans writing for digital fanzines like Shark Bites and Shark Nibbles. And the OSR has revived and continues reviving games. Some games that I actually thought were dead. Some years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine named George Straighton, and I was surprised to learn that people still play white box D&D. I don't mean basic D&D. I mean original D&D, the game that was released 50 years ago. And I think that's awesome. But I was surprised, and I was really impressed by the thoroughness of some of their continued design and design efforts. Last year, I interviewed one of these people. Jason Vey is his name, and if you go to his website, you'll see that he has a ton of expansions for white box Dungeons and Dragons that I think are amazing, and they're free, and you can actually maybe take on some of these expansions or experiments to see how and whether or not you'd like to play original white box D&D. And one of the fun things about exploring that question is finding the different ways to play that game in the first place, because there's no one way. The white box rules are kind of vague, so do you play them with chainmail? Historically, nobody played them with chainmail, but the book says to play them with chainmail, so there's some exploration into how to do that. But the key here is, traditionally, a game has been considered dead when a publisher no longer supports it. But in a post-internet world, or in a world with the internet, when is a game truly dead? Does it require distribution and support from the company or from some official agency to be a living game? Or is even fan support enough to be counted as alive? Or even lacking published support, continued published support from fans, does it merely need people to be playing it to be alive? And this is where I'd like your thoughts. What do you think? When is a game truly dead?
Shall we play a game?
This geek of technology.
He's a Highlander, by God.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to drag